Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to cover the Hindu newspaper dated 15th of February 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion. This news appears on page number 9. Scientists radio tag Indian pangolin. Now, from prelims perspective, this news is extremely important, and we shall understand the importance by looking at two of the questions asked in past years UPSC prelims examination. Now, the first question was asked in 2014, whereas in 2017 also the question was asked along the similar lines. So, let's now discuss the question asked in 2017. According to Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which of the following animals cannot be hunted by any person except under some provisions provided by law? Now, this question basically wants you to know about which of the following animals have been scheduled in Schedule 1 of Wildlife Protection Act. The options are gharial, Indian wild ass, and wild buffalo. And if you see the Schedule 1 of Wildlife Protection Act, gharial, wild buffalo, as well as Indian wild ass, all three of them have been categorized as Schedule 1 animal, and which means that they cannot be hunted by any person except under some provisions provided by this law. And hence the right answer is D, 1, 2 and 3. So now you can see that it is important for us to memorize few of the important species enlisted in Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act. And pangolin is one such animal. And hence it becomes important for us to cover few aspects of Indian and Chinese pangolin. Now the question asked in 2014 prelims examination was, other than poaching, what are the possible reasons for the decline in population of Ganges river dolphins? Statement 1, construction of dams and barrages on rivers. Statement 2, increase in the population of crocodiles in rivers. Statement 3, getting trapped in fishing nets accidentally. And statement 4, use of synthetic fertilizers and other agricultural chemicals in crop fields in the vicinity of rivers. Now, if you analyze all these statements, you will see that there is no antagonistic relationship between crocodiles and dolphins, and hence 2 cannot be included in the right option. So now the first step is to look for those options where the statement 2 is not given, and hence we see that only C is that option where 2 is not written. So it becomes the right answer. Even apart from that, one of the frequently used arguments against the creation of dams and barrages is that the population of dolphins will reduce significantly. And also the news regarding the dolphins getting trapped in fishing nets also appear. And heavy use of chemical fertilizers in the Ganga Valley has also led to a significant decline in their population. Now, you see that UPSC has asked a question related to an important species and threats faced by it. Now, similarly, if you read the article published in the newspaper today about pangolins, it says that pangolin is hunted for meat and used in traditional Chinese medicine. So, the threats for the pangolin has also been given. So, first what we'll do is that we'll first understand the provisions in the Indian Constitution related to the preservation and protection of wildlife. Then we will understand few main provisions related to Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and then we will see few of the important aspects of Indian and Chinese pangolin, which are the two varieties of pangolins found in India. Now, as far as the conservation of wildlife, flora and fauna is concerned, the references in the Constitution appear at 3 places mainly. Now, the first of them is Directive Principles of State Policy under Part 4. The Article 48A says, the state shall endeavour to protect and to improve the environment and to safeguard the forest and wildlife of the country. Now, similarly, under Part 4A, which is fundamental duties, or you can say that under Article 51A, it says that it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. So these are the 2 provisions which are not enforceable because they belong to Part 4 and Part 4A. Now, as far as the legislative responsibility of state and center is concerned, You know that it is guided by the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. And the provisions related to wildlife and cruelty to animals as well as forests found place in list 3, which is the concurrent list. And items 17, 17A and 17B have been mentioned as prevention of cruelty to animals under 17, forests under 17A, and protection of wild animals and birds under 17B. Now, one important thing to mention here is that the entry 17A and 17B have been inserted by the Constitution 42nd Amendment Act of 1976. Whereas the 17th entry, which is prevention of cruelty to animals, existed even before that in the concurrent list. So with this, we'll move on and analyze few of the important features of Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Now, Wildlife Protection Act is that basic legislative framework under which the protection of wildlife, both plants and animals, is conducted in India right now. Now, the objective of the act is to effectively protect the wildlife of this country and to control poaching, smuggling, and illegal trade in wildlife and its various derivatives. Now, as far as the main characteristics of this act is concerned, the first and the most important of them is that it defines wildlife related terminologies. Now, if you read the act, it defines various posts, various kinds of protected areas like national park and wildlife sanctuaries. It categorizes the plants and animals into various kinds of schedules, which we'll see now. So, as far as the constitution or creation is concerned, it creates authorities, schedules, and protected areas for the conservation of wildlife. So let's first understand the authorities which it creates. Now, first and foremost, it creates the National Board for Wildlife. Now, it serves as apex body to review all wildlife related matters and approve projects in and around national parks and sanctuaries. An important thing to remember is that it is chaired by the Prime Minister. Then the Central Zoo Authority is also created by the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Then the Director of Wildlife Preservation is appointed by the central government, is also created by the same act. And the National Tiger Conservation Authority, to be headed by the Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, is also created by the same act. So it is important for you to memorize these authorities created by the act. Now, an important aspect of Wildlife Protection Act 1972 is that it creates sixth schedule, and the categorization of plants and animals into these schedules is contingent upon the level of protection as well as their current status of preservation in the natural ecosystem. So the act has six schedules. Now the schedule 1 and 2 are the most important sections of this act. These schedules cover animals which are in the category of endangered species. Now, the inclusion of an animal under this schedule gives absolute protection to those species which cannot be infringed except for provided in the law. For example, the law says that if a tiger goes rogue, then an official of forest department can certify the hunting. So apart from that, the tiger which is under the schedule 1 cannot be hunted. So the protections like those exist in schedule 1 and schedule 2. Whereas in schedule 3 and 4 also have roughly the same provisions as given in 1 and 2, but the animals included in these third and fourth schedule are not in danger of becoming extinct. And also the penalties for violation of animals under this list is less stringent as compared to this one. Now the schedule 5 enlists animal that can be hunted or vermins, which includes ducks, deers, obviously with the prior permission of Chief Wildlife Warden. Now, whereas Schedule 6 of the Act deals with the plants. Now, as far as protected areas are concerned, the Wildlife Protection Act specifies the processes needed for creation of wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. Now, as far as national parks are concerned, according to the Act, they can be notified by state government, and the reasons on which a state government can notify a creation of national park can be ecological, faunal, floral, geomorphological, or zoological. So it is important for you to remember that the categorization of an area into national park is not dependent only on animals. But such categorization can be on the basis of a geomorphological features as well as on a basis of flora or the plants. So these are the important aspects of Wildlife Protection Act 1972 with special emphasis on prelims examination. Let us now have a look at few important information about pangolin. Now pangolin is scaly anteater found in Indian subcontinent. Now, the special feature of pangolins are that they have overlapping scales on their body which acts as their body armor. An interesting trait of pangolin is that it can curl itself into a ball as self-defense against predators such as tiger. Now, as far as the feeding habits of pangolins are concerned, they are insectivorous, feeding mainly on ants and termites. Now, as far as the distribution of pangolin in India is concerned, you can see on the map that the portion plotted with yellow color is for Indian pangolin, whereas the portion colored with brown color is that of Chinese pangolin. So these are the two kinds of pangolins found in India. Now, except for the northeastern Himalayas, the total area of India is mainly covered by the Indian pangolin. Whereas in Assam and Meghalaya, there is an overlap between these two pangolins. Now, as far as the threats are concerned, they are mainly hunted for their meat. Also, they have a high demand as an ingredient in Chinese traditional medicine. Also, there is a high demand for their skins or scales in international market. Now, you can see that large varieties of pangolin scales are frequently caught by the wildlife officers as well as custom officials, and they have high demand in leather industry as far as manufacture of coat and the boots are concerned. Now, both Chinese as well as Indian pangolin has been enlisted in Schedule 1 of Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which means that they have the highest level of protection. Let's now move on to the next news. Now, the editorial Choice and Candidacy on page number 10 discusses the recent decision of the Supreme Court with respect to the criminalization of politics. Now, as the incidence of people's representative with criminal background is increasing, the top court has come up with additional requirements as far as the people's representatives are concerned. So, the important observations as well as the conditions laid down by the Supreme Court shall be discussed at the last. Now, this particular article becomes extremely important from the perspective of GS2, where the syllabus mentions salient features of the Representation of the People's Act, as well as parliament and state legislatures, their functioning, and the criminalization of politics, as we know, that leads to the entry of criminals into our state legislatures and central parliament, and which affects their functioning. So, we shall be covering criminalization of politics, its causes, its effect, and the measures which have been taken so far, and finally we will suggest some way forward as well. First, let us understand the context in which we are talking about the criminalization of politics. Now, the image on the screen shows the percentage of criminals in our parliament, and this bar is for 2009, this is for 2014 and for 2019. The bar in the dark red color shows the percentage of winners with declared criminal cases, whereas the orange bar shows those with serious criminal charges such as murder and rape. Now, if you see that as far as overall criminal cases are concerned, the people with such number of cases against them have increased from 30% to 34% to 43% in the current Lok Sabha. Whereas if you consider the people charged with the heinous or the serious criminal cases, their percentage has increased from 14% in 2009 to 21% in 2014 to currently at 29%. If you want to put this data another way, you can say that every 1 out of 3 MP has a serious criminal charge against him or her. And this data has been taken from ADR website. So this indicates a very bad state of affairs as far as our parliamentarians are concerned. Now we need to dwell into the causes of such criminalization of Indian politics. Now, as far as the reasons for the criminalization of politics is concerned, the first and the foremost reason behind it is the vote bank politics. Now, vote bank politics is, that a block of voters that form a single community and act very loyally towards the members of their own community or their own ethnic groups. The dominance of vote bank politics in India means that the voters ignore all other negative characteristics of the contestant and just focus on his or her identity, and which leads to the selection of criminals. And the basic reason behind this phenomena is that the voter in India is not organically evolved, and therefore the majority of voters in the country right now are easily maneuverable as well as purchasable, and hence it leads to the entry of criminals. Now, the second most important reason behind criminalization is judicial delays. The data from the Association of Democratic Rights, which we just saw on the last slide, shows that around 30% of the MPs have the criminal charges pressed against them. And obviously, the judicial process is not able to keep pace with the rapid pace at which these cases are being filed. And since the delays range from anywhere around 10 years to 20 years, by then the criminal person who has become an MP has already served at least 3 or 4 consecutive terms into the parliament. Then next comes the legal issues or the loopholes in the current legal framework. As you know that the disqualification of the member of the parliament from the membership as well as from contesting elections right now is governed by Representation of the People's Act 1951. But under the Section 8 of RPA 1951, the person is debarred only after his or her conviction. And since there is no disqualification if a charge sheet or a case is filed against a person, and hence it leads to the entry of criminals into the politics. Also, the Representation of People's Act 1951 makes Representation of the People's Act 1951 makes no rules regarding the people either convicted or facing the charge sheets to hold offices in the political party. So, for example, if a person has been convicted of a murder at a district court, now that person cannot contest an election, but that doesn't mean that this person cannot hold office of any of the political parties. So, for example, that person can become a president of a party but cannot contest an election. Another reason for the increasing criminalization of Indian politics is the massive expenditure which is incurred in the process of election. As we know that the elections in India have become extremely competitive and people have to shell out massive chunks of money in order to win an election, and the criminals in India have access to black money which increases their winnability criteria. Now, one of the reasons behind political parties resorting to distributing tickets to the criminals is that their overall winnability is very high, as they command not only money but also the muscle power. So after analyzing the reasons behind the criminalization of Indian politics, let us now analyze the impact which they have over India's politics as well as the governance. Now, criminalization of politics enables the lawbreakers to become the lawmakers, and this leads to the damage of overall system. And how does it happen? Number one, it leads to the loss of public faith in the parliament. Now, as you know that parliament enacts laws for overall country. The legitimacy of the laws are basically derived from the authenticity of the members of the parliament. And if people start losing the trust and faith in the parliament, there shall be no rule of law in the country. The second most important impact which criminalization of politics has is that it leads to distorted lawmaking. The simple example can be that a parliament housed by criminals would never lead to the passage of a bill which shall decriminalize the politics. So, for example, if a person brings up a bill which talks about disqualifying a person as soon as a charge sheet is filed against him or her, and if the same house has around 30% MPs who are serious criminals, then that lawmaking body would never pass that bill. And hence it is easy to understand how criminalization leads to distorted lawmaking. And third and the most important impact of criminalization is the issues with the law enforcement. Now, as we know that the cases being filed against these lawmakers are mostly investigated by the police. The entry of these criminals into the parliament not only provides them with certain kind of immunity, but also gives them influence over executive, which then leads to the distortion of investigation and prosecution by the police. And also, you should keep in mind that the parliament is that body which allows expropriation of the money from various funds of the government of India. Also, these members, after becoming the parliament, have the chance to become minister and control expenses directly, and this shall have direct impact on overall increased level of the corruption in the country. So overall, you can see that from the perspective of mains examination, it is important for us to understand the reasons behind the criminalization of politics and the impact which this has on overall governance of the country. But Indian state has created various mechanisms to control the criminalization of politics. First, let us understand those, and after that we'll understand the changes which are needed. Now, first, let us talk about the mechanisms which are in existence as far as the constitutional provisions, legal provisions, and judicial pronouncement are concerned. Now, Article 102, Clause 1 and Article 191, Clause 1 give Parliament the power to enact laws and specify conditions which can lead to the disqualification of both Member of Parliament as well as members of legislative assemblies. And utilizing the powers given in these two articles, the provisions under Representation of the People's Act 1951 have been created under Section 8. Now, as we have already seen that the Section 8 debars the person from becoming an MP or from being an MP or MLA if they are convicted at any level in the courts in India. But it does nothing for those who are facing trials. So a person has to be convicted by a court in India once in order to be disqualified. And if a person is just facing trials and has never been convicted, there is no law to disqualify that person. And this is the legal loophole which has been utilized by the politicians in the country so far. Now, as far as the judicial pronouncements are concerned, the Lily Thomas case in 2013 is very important as it removed Section 8(4) of the Representation of the People Act. Now, what Section 8(4) did was that it protected the members of parliament as well as the legislative assemblies from disqualification if they file an appeal against the conviction within 3 months. After the removal of the Section 8(4), now the conviction in serious offences means disqualification and an appeal can't help. On the other hand, Lok Prahari versus Union of India as well as Public Interest Foundation versus Union of India judgments have led to mandatory disclosure of criminal antecedents by the contestants to an election. So earlier there was no obligation on behalf of the contestants to disclose what criminal charges they are facing. But now it has become mandatory for all the contestants to declare their criminal antecedents to an election. Also in 2014, Supreme Court directed all subordinate courts to give final verdict on criminal cases involving MPs and MLAs. But even after the existence of these mechanisms, we see that the criminalization has not abated, but on the other hand, it is increasing as indicated by the graph we saw in the first slide. So obviously there is a need to do something more. In this regard, let us understand the way forward. Now, the first suggestion is directly taken from Law Commission report on electoral disqualification, as well as it has been mentioned in second Administrative Reform Commission reports, and it is about the disqualification at the stage of framing of charges. That means that as soon as the police frames charges against a person, that person should become ineligible to contest elections. And with regard to the political usage of such mechanism, certain safeguards have also been suggested in the second arc. And the second suggestion deals with the amendments to the Representation of the People's Act 1951, under which the criminals who are convicted as well as facing charges should be debarred from holding any party office in India. And if these two changes are made in the current legal framework, this shall significantly reduce the number of criminals participating in our democratic process. Now, as in the past, where the major improvements in our electoral reforms have been brought due to the Supreme Court, the recent order of the court is also along the same lines. Now, the parties have been asked to explain the choices of the candidates and why those with the criminal cases pending against them were preferred over those with the clean record. Now, the court has also asked national and regional parties to disclose the reason for their selection with reference to qualification, achievements, and merit of candidates concerned. And Supreme Court had strictly said that Winnability is no more a criteria for justifying a ticket to a particular person. Now, in addition to full disclosure of the cases pending against these candidates on their official websites and social media accounts, the court has mandated that the parties should also publish these details in local regional language paper as well as in national daily. Now it is expected that these steps, if implemented, will bring right amount of transparency into our electoral system. Now, this whole discussion is extremely important from the perspective of mains examination, although not so much from the perspective of prelims examination, except for the fact that you have to memorize the Article 102 and 191 as they deal with the disqualification of the persons from Parliament and state legislature. Now, this news appears on page number 1 as well as on 15. Now, Supreme Court has ordered the companies to show cause why contempt proceedings should not be initiated against them for failing to pay even a single rupee to the government in adjusted gross revenue dues worth rupees 1.47 lakh crore. Despite the fact that Supreme Court has ordered such a payment in 2019 judgment. So in this regard, it is important for us to understand what the adjusted gross revenue is, what were the key points of 2019 judgment. So the aspects related to the AGR has been covered in Daily News Simplified dated 3rd of November 2019 by Nagendra sir. And you can see that the details of AGR, what does it mean, how is it calculated, what shall be the implication on telecom sector of such a decision. Apart from that, the main issues plaguing the telecom sector were also discussed, like extremely low call rates, high level of competition, unprecedented level of debts and bankruptcy, and heavy license fees. So it is advisable that you go through the DNS dated 3rd of November 2019. Now this issue was covered again in detail by Baswa sir in Daily News Simplified dated 17th of January 2020, and you can say that again the similar aspects were covered. Since the issues related to AGR have already been covered twice in last 2 months, we are not going to cover. But it is important for us to have a look at important timelines. So keep in mind that the issue related to adjusted gross revenues began in 2005 when government's definition of AGR calculation was challenged by telecom firms. According to the government, AGR must include all revenues. But the companies insisted that AGR should include only revenues from core services. Now, the final judgment of TDSAT, which is Telecom Dispute Settlement and Appellate Tribunal, came in 2015, which ruled in favor of the companies and agreed with them that while calculating AGR, only revenues from core services should be taken into account. Now, this judgment of TDSAT was again challenged by the government, and Supreme Court finally in 2019 set aside TDSAT's judgment, saying that the definition given by the government is correct and telecom firms owe around 1.5 lakh crore to the government. But the failure of these companies to pay a single penny in last 2.5 months has irked Supreme Court. Now, in the decision given yesterday, Supreme Court has threatened telecom firms with contempt proceedings if telecom firms further delay those payments of AGR. Now, as a result of Supreme Court's yesterday's judgment, Bharti Airtel has committed to deposit around 10,000 crore as part of its AGR related dues and has promised to clear the remaining amounts well before 17th of March, which is the date of next hearing in the Supreme Court. Now, this article 1 Asia 2 Perspectives appears on page number 10 in the form of article. It is important for us to realize that although a few articles appear to be very important, but if analyzed from the perspective of UPSC exam requirements, they may not be very suitable. And this particular editorial is the best example of that. What it does is that it compares the view of two economists of the world on Asian economies. Now, the first one is the Nobel laureate Gunnar Myrdal, and the second one is the Deepak Nair, whose book has been recently released. And what author through this editorial tries to show is the contradictions between the observations and the predictions made by these two economists. And the points on which the main emphasis in this article has been laid deal with the topics which have been discussed multiple times. For example, the transition of Asian economies from agriculture to manufacturing to services, and the low savings turning into low investment. So there is nothing new in this article as far as prelims and mains examination is concerned. So we are not going to discuss this. Let's now move on to the questions for prelims examination. Consider the following statements about wildlife protection in India. Statement 1. The matter is covered in list 2 of the 7th schedule. Whereas statement 2 reads, there is no mention of wildlife in directive principles of state policy. Now these both statements are incorrect, as the matter related to wildlife is covered in list 3 of the 7th schedule, which means that it comes under the concurrent list. Whereas there is a mention of wildlife in directive principles of state policy under Article 48A. And hence both these statements are incorrect, which leads us to the right answer, neither one nor two. Now the second question reads, consider the following statements about pangolin in India. Statement 1 reads, it is categorized in Schedule 1 of Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which is correct. And the second statement reads, Chinese pangolin is found in northern India, which is incorrect, as we saw that Chinese pangolin is found only in the northeastern part of India, whereas in the rest of the parts only Indian pangolin is found, and hence the right answer is A, one only. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Let's have a look at the question of the day. Now first we'll discuss the question of the day for 14th of February 2020. Consider the following statements. Statement 1. All medical devices are regulated as drugs in India. Statement 2. Central Drug Standards Control Organization regulates medical devices. And the answer is that both of these statements are correct. Now it's time for us to take up the question of the day for 15th of February 2020. Consider the following articles. Article 102, Article 191, Article 103 and Article 192. So 4 articles have been given. The question asks which of them deal with disqualifications of people's representative, and the options are A. 1 and 2 only, B. 3 and 4 only, C. 1 and 3 only, and D. 1, 2, 3 and 4.